The courtroom went so quiet I could hear the old ceiling fan clicking above the judge's bench. "She's an imposter," my brother shouted in court. Then a federal agent placed a sealed envelope on the judge's desk. His eyes widened. "Put him in cuffs." My father's face went pale. "Wait, what?" For a moment nobody moved. Not the bailiff, not the lawyers, not even the judge. The entire courtroom in Norfolk County seemed frozen in place like one of those old photographs my mother used to keep in dusty albums upstairs. The only sound came from my brother Daniel's breathing. Fast, uneven, panicked. Then the bailiff stepped forward. "Sir, stand up and place your hands behind your back." Daniel blinked like he hadn't heard correctly. "What? No, this is insane. She's the liar. She's the one." "Now, sir." The handcuffs clicked loudly enough to echo against the wooden walls. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my hands folded in my lap. 30 years in the Navy had taught me something important. Panic spreads quickly. Calm spreads slower, but it lasts longer. My father stood halfway from his chair in the gallery, gripping the wooden bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. "There's been a mistake," he said shakily. "My son didn't do anything." The federal agent didn't even look at him. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed both eyes before turning toward me. "Commander Evelyn Brooks," he said carefully, "why was this court not informed of your federal status earlier?" I answered quietly. "Because I was trying to keep this a family matter, Your Honor." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Family," he snapped. "You disappeared for 30 years. That one landed harder than I expected. Not because it was true. Because part of me had spent most of my life afraid it was." The judge ordered a recess. People immediately began whispering around the courtroom. Norfolk wasn't a large enough city for scandals like this to stay quiet long, especially not ones involving federal investigators and military records. I stayed seated while my attorney Linda Carver leaned closer to me. "You all right?" "I've been better." She gave me a small nod. Linda was around my age, late 50s, sharp as a tack with silver hair she refused to dye. She'd spent 20 years handling military family cases around coastal Virginia. "You understand this changes everything now," she said. "I know. You still want to keep the financial records sealed from the press." I looked over toward my father. Frank Brooks, 79 years old, Korean War veteran's son, worked 42 years at the shipyard before retirement. Proud man, hard man. And at that moment he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Yes," I told her softly, "no matter what Daniel did, he's still my father's son." Linda studied me for a second like she was trying to understand something. Then she sighed. "You Navy people are built different." I almost smiled at that. Almost. Across the room, Daniel was arguing loudly with the federal marshals, while another man in a dark suit opened a thick file folder. The sealed envelope sat on the judge's bench like a live grenade. That envelope had changed everything in less than 60 seconds. And the strange thing was, I never wanted it opened in the first place. 3 months earlier, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in a Virginia courtroom while my own brother got arrested for fraud connected to my Navy records, I would have laughed in their face. Back then, my biggest concern had been retirement. I'd retired from the Navy the previous fall after 30 years of service. Commander Evelyn Brooks, logistics and operations support, nothing glamorous, no movie-worthy stories, mostly long deployments, paperwork, classified transport coordination, and years spent helping younger sailors survive careers that could swallow whole marriages and families. I rented a modest condo near Chesapeake Bay after retirement. Quiet place, good fishing nearby, older neighbors who minded their business. For the first time in decades, life had slowed down. Then my mother died. That phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Daniel called me from Norfolk General Hospital. "You better come now," he said flatly, "if you even care." No hello. No warning. Just that. I remember staring out my kitchen window at the rain running down the glass while my coffee turned cold beside me. When did it happen? About an hour ago. I closed my eyes. What about Dad? He's devastated. There was accusation tucked inside every word he spoke. There always had been. "I'll be there tonight," I said. "You should have come sooner." Then he hung up. That was Daniel. My younger brother had a gift for making every conversation feel like a trial. By the time I arrived at my parents' house the next evening, casseroles already lined the kitchen counters. Church friends filled the living room speaking in hushed voices, while old country music played softly from the radio. My father barely looked at me when I walked in. "You made it," he said. "Not good to see you." "Not your mother missed you." Just that. "You made it." I hugged him anyway. His body felt fragile beneath his flannel shirt. Daniel stood near the dining room holding court like he owned the place. He shook hands, accepted condolences, told stories about helping Mom through her final weeks. If you listened long enough, you'd think he'd carried the whole family alone. And maybe in some ways he believed he had. "Evelyn." I turned and saw my Aunt Ruth pulling me into a hug. "You look tired, sweetheart." I drove straight through. "She talked about you all the time," Ruth whispered. That caught me off guard. "She did." "Oh, honey, constantly." Before I could answer, Daniel walked over holding 2 cups of coffee. "1 cream, no sugar," he said, handing me one. I stared at it for a second. He remembered. After all these years, he still remembered how I took my coffee. "Thanks," I said quietly. For one brief moment, standing there in my parents' kitchen with rain tapping against the windows and mourners speaking softly nearby, I thought maybe grief had changed us. Maybe losing Mom had finally stripped away decades of resentment. Maybe we could still become a family before it was too late. I had no idea then that my brother had already stolen nearly everything my mother left behind. And I certainly had no idea the federal government was about to enter our lives. When people ask me today whether favoritism can destroy a family, I tell them this. It rarely destroys a family all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, like rust underneath an old truck. By the time you finally see the damage, the whole frame is already cracked underneath. That was my family. And looking back now, I think my mother spent most of her life trying to hold together 2 men who never truly understood each other, my father and my brother. I was simply the person standing between them. I grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, back when the shipyards still ruled everything. My father, Frank Brooks, worked maintenance at Norfolk Naval Shipyard 6 days a week. He believed in hard work, country music, black coffee, and keeping your feelings to yourself. He also believed boys mattered more. Not cruelly, not openly. Men of his generation rarely said things outright. It showed up in smaller ways. Daniel got praised for effort. I got criticized for results. If Daniel brought home a C in math, Dad slapped him on the back and said, "Well, at least you tried." If I brought home an A-, he'd ask why it wasn't an A. That was simply the weather system inside our house. You stopped questioning it after a while. My mother, Lorraine, tried her best to balance things. She'd sneak encouragement into ordinary moments while washing dishes or folding laundry. "You're steady," she used to tell me. "People trust steady." At the time, I didn't understand how valuable those words would become. Daniel was 3 years younger than me, and born with the kind of charm that fills a room before a person even speaks. Teachers loved him, girls loved him, coaches loved him. Dad adored him. And honestly, for a long time I did too. When we were children, Daniel followed me everywhere. We built forts behind the garage, rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, shared comic books and peanut butter sandwiches during summer storms. But something shifted when we became teenagers. Maybe it was because I stopped trying to please people. Or maybe Daniel noticed before I did that our father measured worth differently between sons and daughters. Either way, the distance started growing early. I remember one particular night during my senior year of high school. Dad had come home exhausted from work. His back hurt constantly by then, though he never admitted it. Daniel had just made varsity baseball. The whole dinner table revolved around him. Mom cooked pot roast, Dad talked baseball statistics. Daniel laughed and replayed every moment from practice. I mostly listened. Then Dad looked over at me. "So," he said, cutting into his meat, "you finally decide what college you're applying to." I set down my fork. "I'm not going to college." The room went quiet. Mom looked up first. "What do you mean?" "I talked to a Navy recruiter today." Dad actually laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind adults use when they think someone said something foolish. "The Navy." "Yes, sir." "For what secretarial work?" I swallowed hard. "No, sir, logistics operations." Daniel smirked. "You get seasick riding ferries." I was 12. Dad leaned back in his chair slowly. "You're serious about this?" "I am." He stared at me for several seconds before shaking his head. "I don't understand girls these days." "Girls, not women. Not daughters. Girls." Mom tried to smooth things over. "Frank, the military can be a good opportunity." "For boys," he interrupted. I still remember the heat rising into my face. "With respect, Dad, women serve too. Not in combat." "I didn't say combat." "You know what I mean." The conversation ended there, but something permanent changed in the room that night. For the first time in my life, I realized my father had already decided who I was allowed to become. And I realized something else too. I wasn't going to ask permission anymore. 3 months later, I left for boot camp. Mom cried at the bus station. Dad shook my hand like I was a distant neighbor. Daniel didn't come at all. The Navy changed me fast. Not because it made me tougher, because it made me quieter. There's something about military life civilians don't fully understand unless they've lived beside it. The constant movement, the uncertainty, the way entire years disappear while everyone back home keeps aging without you. You miss funerals, birthdays, anniversaries. Your parents get older in photographs instead of in front of your eyes. And every time you come home, the world feels slightly unfamiliar. Especially for women in the service back then. People today forget how difficult it could be during the 80s and 90s. You had to prove competence constantly. One mistake followed you forever. Men could be difficult and still respected. Women had to be nearly flawless. I learned quickly that emotions were dangerous in professional spaces. So I became disciplined instead. Reliable. Steady. Exactly what my mother always said. Over time, promotions came, then overseas assignments, then classified operational support work I rarely discussed even with family. Every Christmas I mailed gifts home. Every birthday I called. And every conversation with Dad lasted under 5 minutes. "How's work?" "Fine." "You staying safe?" "Yes, sir." "Well, good." Click. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed in Norfolk. He bounced between jobs for years: auto sales, roofing a failed landscaping business. But somehow Dad always described him as finding his footing. By his 40s, Daniel had become the kind of man who always needed rescuing financially, while somehow remaining everyone else's favorite. And my mother kept rescuing him. Car payments, rent, credit cards, little emergencies that never seemed to end. I helped too, though, quietly. When Dad's arthritis surgeries got expensive, I wired money. When Mom needed home repairs, I paid anonymously through a contractor friend. I never told them. Not because I wanted credit. Because I already knew who would receive it. Daniel. "Your brother's been helping us so much lately," Mom would say warmly on the phone. And I would simply answer, "I'm glad." That became my role in the family. The distant daughter. The dependable wallet. The woman nobody fully understood. Then came the phone call about Mom's stroke. And for the first time in decades, I came home planning to stay longer than a weekend. I truly believed grief might heal us. Instead, grief exposed everything that had been rotting underneath for years. Especially my brother. My mother's funeral took place on a gray Saturday morning, under low coastal clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. That felt appropriate somehow. Everything in our family had always hovered on the edge of something heavier. The church sat only 15 minutes from the naval shipyard where my father had spent most of his adult life. Red brick, white steeple, narrow stained glass windows that turned sunlight blue and gold across the pews. I arrived early wearing a simple black dress and my old pearl earrings, the ones Mom gave me before my first overseas deployment. "You should have something beautiful when you travel," she'd said. I touched those earrings 3 times before entering the church. Old habit. Navy life teaches you rituals for calming nerves. Inside, Daniel already stood near the front greeting people like a politician during campaign season. His tie was perfect. His smile practiced. His voice carried just enough grief to sound convincing. "There she is," he announced when he saw me. "My sister finally made it." A few heads turned. That word finally hung in the air on purpose. I ignored it. I came as fast as I could. "Well," he said with a shrug, "Mom waited a long time." Same smile. Same knife underneath. I glanced toward my father sitting alone in the front pew. He looked smaller every time I saw him now. His shoulders rounded, his hands spotted with age. Grief had hollowed out his face in only a few days. I sat beside him quietly. "Morning, Dad." He nodded without looking at me. "You speak with the pastor yet?" "Last night." "That's good." Then silence again. I used to think silence meant peace when I was younger. Now I understood silence could also mean exhaustion. The service itself was beautiful. Simple, honest, exactly what my mother would have wanted. Pastor Green spoke about kindness, patience, and quiet service to others. He mentioned Mom volunteering at church suppers, organizing donation drives, helping military wives while their husbands deployed. Then he said something that caught me off guard. Lorraine Brooks spent her life making people feel less alone. I nearly broke right there. Because it was true. Mom had spent decades cushioning sharp edges inside our family, smoothing arguments, excusing behavior, filling emotional holes before anyone else noticed them. And now she was gone. After the burial, everyone gathered back at the house for food and coffee. The same little ranch-style home where I'd grown up. Nothing inside had changed much. Same wallpaper, same squeaky kitchen floor, same faint smell of cigarette smoke trapped inside curtains from 20 years ago. Only now the house felt strangely unprotected. Like the person holding it together had finally let go. Church friends filled the dining room carrying casseroles and pies, while old family acquaintances approached me one after another. "Your mother was proud of you. She kept your Navy photos on the mantle. She talked about you constantly." Every single comment surprised me. Because my father rarely talked about my career at all. Neither did Daniel. Over time I'd started assuming my mother didn't either. But apparently she had. Constantly. That realization sat heavy in my chest all afternoon. At one point I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath and noticed Daniel coming downstairs from my parents' bedroom carrying a small metal lockbox. He froze when he saw me. "What's that?" "Paperwork." "For what?" "Estate stuff." I frowned slightly. "Already." He gave me an irritated look. "Somebody has to handle things, Evelyn." The way he said my name always sounded like criticism. "I can help. I've been helping for years." There it was again. That resentment. Not loud. Just simmering beneath everything. Before I could answer, he brushed past me toward the kitchen carrying the box. Something about the interaction stayed with me. Not because of the lockbox itself. Because Daniel looked nervous. That evening after most guests left, I sat alone on the back porch watching dusk settle over the neighborhood. The air smelled like wet grass and salt from the bay. Dad eventually stepped outside holding 2 beers. Without speaking, he handed me one. We sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, he said, "Your mother hated when you two fought." I stared out into the yard. "We barely talk enough to fight." "That's not true." "No." He sighed heavily. "You always judged your brother." I actually laughed softly at that. "Dad, Daniel's 55 years old. So somebody should have expected responsibility from him by now." Dad's expression hardened immediately. He stayed. There it was. The real issue. Not money. Not arguments. Not old resentment. I left. That was the unforgivable thing. He stayed with you and Mom-Dad continued. He handled doctors' medications, hospital visits. And I sent money every month. He looked surprised. "What?" I took a slow sip of beer. "For years." "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." Dad shook his head instantly. "Daniel helped with expenses. Daniel transferred the payments." The silence afterward felt different. Uncomfortable. Confused. Dad stared out toward the yard for several long seconds. "Well," he muttered, "finally he never said that." Of course he didn't. I almost explained everything then. The mortgage payments. The repair bills. The medical expenses. But I stopped myself. Because deep down I already understood something painful. Dad didn't really want the truth. He wanted the version of the family that made him comfortable. And Daniel had spent years building exactly that version for him. The next morning I woke early and started helping clean the house. While organizing kitchen paperwork, I noticed several overdue notices tucked beneath a pile of magazines. Electric bills. Insurance warnings. Past due pharmacy balances. That made no sense. I knew how much money I'd been sending. Later that afternoon, while Dad napped in his recliner, I quietly asked Mom's longtime friend Gloria if things had been difficult financially. Gloria hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. Your mother was worried near the end. About what? She thought somebody was moving money around. Cold spread through my stomach. What do you mean? Gloria looked toward the living room. She didn't trust some of the papers Daniel had her signing. I felt suddenly wide awake. What papers? She didn't say exactly. When was this? Maybe 6 months ago. My pulse started pounding slowly. Not panic. Training. Focus. There's a moment during Navy operations when your instincts quietly tell you something underneath the surface is wrong. I'd learned never to ignore that feeling. That night after Dad went to bed, I searched through the kitchen file cabinet looking for insurance documents. Instead, I found missing bank statements, withdrawal slips, property transfer paperwork, and one signature that made my blood run cold. My mother's name, signed shakily, dated 3 days after her stroke. I stared at the page for a long time. Then I turned to the final section, witnessed by Daniel Brooks. Suddenly, the hallway light flipped on. Daniel stood there. His expression changed instantly when he saw the papers in my hands. You shouldn't be going through that. I stood slowly. What is this? Legal paperwork. She signed this after the stroke. So, she could barely speak. His jaw tightened. You have no idea what you're talking about. How much did you take? The question hit him harder than I expected. Not outrage. Fear. Real fear. Then his face hardened. You know what your problem is, Evelyn? I said nothing. You disappear for decades and come back acting like some damn hero. I asked you a question, and I'm tired of answering to you. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Mom knew who actually stayed around here. I looked down again at the shaking signature on the paper. For the first time in my life, I realized my brother might not simply be selfish. He might actually be dangerous. I didn't sleep much after finding those papers. The old house creaked all night, the way older homes do near the coast pipes, knocking softly floorboards, settling wind brushing against siding worn down by decades of salt air. Every sound seemed louder because my mind refused to quiet down. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 a.m, staring at copies of withdrawal slips and transfer forms. Something wasn't right. And deep down, I think I already knew it was bigger than ordinary greed. At 6:30 the next morning, I brewed coffee while watching the sunrise through the curtains above the sink. Mom used to stand in that exact spot every morning humming Patsy Cline songs while packing Dad's lunchbox. The memory hit harder than expected. Grief works that way at our age. It doesn't arrive dramatically anymore. It sneaks up quietly in ordinary moments. The scrape of a chair. A familiar perfume. An empty room that still feels occupied. I heard Dad shuffling down the hallway before I saw him. You're up early, he muttered. Couldn't sleep. He poured himself coffee and lowered into his chair, carefully wincing from arthritis. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then I slid one of the bank statements across the table. What's this? He asked. You tell me. He adjusted his glasses. I watched confusion slowly spread across his face. This account had $30,000 in it last year, I said quietly. Now it's almost empty. Dad frowned. Your mother handled savings. Did she? He looked up sharply. What's that supposed to mean? I reached for another document. These transfers started after her stroke. He stared at the paperwork silently. That can't be right. It is. His face tightened immediately. You accusing your brother of something? I'm asking questions. You've been home 3 days. And in 3 days I found missing money. Dad pushed the papers away angrily. You always think the worst of him. That sentence settled over the kitchen like old smoke. Always. Not sometimes. Always. I leaned back slowly. Dad, when was the last time you actually reviewed your accounts yourself? His silence answered for him. That scared me more than the missing money. Older parents trust familiarity, especially fathers like mine. Men raised believing family loyalty mattered more than paperwork. Daniel understood that. And if I was right, he'd been exploiting it for years. Around noon, I drove to the bank branch listed on the statements. The manager, a woman named Cynthia Harper, recognized my last name immediately. "Oh, your mother was lovely," she said warmly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you." I explained that I was helping organize estate paperwork and needed clarification on several recent transfers. The second she reviewed the account activity, her expression changed slightly. Not alarm. Caution. "I'm afraid I can't discuss certain details without legal authorization." That answer told me plenty already. I handed over my identification. "Retired Navy Commander." Executor inquiry paperwork from my attorney. Cynthia studied everything carefully before lowering her voice. Mrs. Brooks came in several times before her stroke, expressing concerns. Ice slid down my spine. What kind of concerns? She believed someone was pressuring her financially. Did she say who? Cynthia hesitated too long. That was answer enough. Were these signatures verified? Some were signed electronically. My mother barely used email. Again that hesitation. Then Cynthia finally said the sentence that changed everything. "There may already be a pending review." I stared at her. "A review by who?" "I'm not authorized to discuss that. Military training teaches you how to read people under pressure." And at that moment, Cynthia Harper looked genuinely nervous. Not about me. About the situation itself. I left the bank and immediately called Linda Carver. She listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, she asked only one question. "Do you trust your brother?" "Number. Do you trust your father?" The question caught me off guard. With what? The truth. I looked out across the parking lot toward the gray Chesapeake sky. "I don't know anymore." Linda sighed softly. "Come see me tomorrow morning." The next 48 hours unraveled fast. Linda's office overlooked downtown Norfolk, only a few blocks from the waterfront. Framed Navy photographs lined her walls beside degrees and legal certificates. After reviewing the documents, she sat back slowly. "This isn't simple inheritance fraud." "What do you mean?" She tapped one form carefully. "These account numbers connect to federal survivor benefit deposits." I frowned. "Military benefits." "Yes." My stomach tightened immediately. After my mother's health declined several years earlier, I'd arranged additional survivor assistance connected to certain classified service compensation programs. Legal, approved, quiet. Very quiet. Only limited people even knew those funds existed. Including Daniel. "How bad is this?" I asked. Linda removed her glasses. "If someone redirected federal military-related payments using forged authorization..." She paused. "Potentially very bad." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What happens now?" "We investigate carefully." But somebody else was already investigating. I discovered that 3 days later. I was helping Dad sort through garage shelves when a dark sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 men stepped out. One wore a plain suit. The other wore navy dress whites. Dad stiffened immediately. "Who the hell is that?" The uniformed officer approached calmly. "Commander Evelyn Brooks." "Yes." He handed me identification. "Special Agent Marcus Hale. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. NCIS." Dad looked utterly confused. "What's this about?" Agent Hale remained professional but respectful. "We've been attempting to contact Commander Brooks regarding irregular access tied to military benefit records." Daniel walked out from inside the house, right then carrying a beer. The second he saw the agents, all color drained from his face. That reaction told me everything. "Mr. Brooks," Agent Hale said evenly, "we'd like to ask you several questions." Daniel recovered fast. "What is this, some kind of joke?" "No, sir." Dad stepped forward angrily. "My son hasn't done anything." The agent ignored him. "Sir, were you involved in submitting digital verification forms related to Commander Brooks's military records?" Daniel laughed too loudly. "I don't know anything about military forms." "Interesting," Hale replied calmly, "because your IP address appears on several encrypted submissions." Silence. Complete silence. I watched Daniel carefully. His hands were shaking. Tiny tremors. Fear again. Real fear. Dad looked between all of us helplessly. Daniel. My brother suddenly pointed toward me. She told me to handle paperwork. I stared at him in disbelief. What? You were never here. Somebody had to take care of things. Agent Hale's expression hardened slightly. Sir, falsifying federal military documentation carries significant criminal penalties. Dad finally exploded. This is ridiculous. He's her brother. The older agent beside Hale finally spoke for the first time. Sir, he said quietly, family fraud is one of the most common financial crimes against elderly Americans. That sentence hit my father like a slap. Because suddenly this wasn't just about us anymore. It was something uglier. More common. More real. Daniel looked trapped now. Cornered animals either collapse or attack. My brother chose attack. 2 days later, he filed formal accusations against me in county court, claiming I manipulated our mother financially using classified military influence. Linda read the complaint twice before muttering, "Well, your brother just made the worst mistake of his life." Because once Daniel dragged federal military records into open court, the Navy stopped treating this like a private family dispute. And somewhere behind closed doors, somebody prepared a sealed envelope with my name on it. By the morning of the hearing, the rain had finally arrived. A cold April rain. The kind that turns Norfolk streets silver before sunrise and makes old people complain about their knees over diner coffee. I stood alone beside the courthouse window watching water slide down the glass while adjusting the cuffs of my navy blue blazer. Not uniform, just civilian clothes. I hadn't worn dress whites in almost 8 months. Retirement still felt strange on my shoulders. You look calm, Linda said beside me. I'm trying. You succeeding? Not really. She smiled faintly. Good, nervous people stay sharp. The courthouse itself was old Virginia brick and polished wood built sometime back in the 1940s. You could smell old paper in the hallways, old money, old arguments. The kind of place where generations of families brought their worst moments. Divorces, custody fights, probate disputes. And now us. I spotted Dad sitting near the far end of the hallway with Daniel. Neither had noticed me yet. My father looked exhausted. He wore the same brown suit from Mom's funeral hanging looser on him now. Daniel sat beside him talking rapidly, leaning forward, performing confidence. Even from across the hallway I recognized the act. He was scared. Dad finally looked up and saw me. For a brief second something softened in his face. Then Daniel noticed me too. The softness disappeared immediately. Daniel stood first. Well, he called loudly enough for nearby people to hear look who finally showed up. Linda muttered under her breath. Charming. I walked toward them calmly. Morning, Dad. He nodded stiffly. Daniel folded his arms. You really brought lawyers into this. You filed the lawsuit. You forced me to. There it was again. Nothing was ever Daniel's fault. Not the missing funds, not the forged records, not the lies. Everything simply happened to him. Dad cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe we can still settle this quietly. I looked at him carefully. Did Daniel tell you about the federal investigation? Dad's eyes flickered toward his son. He said it's a misunderstanding. Of course he did. Dad. We're done discussing this, Daniel snapped suddenly. His voice echoed harder than he intended. Several people turned to look. Then I noticed something else. 2 men in dark suits standing near the courthouse entrance. Watching. Not casually. Professionally. Federal. Daniel noticed them too. The color drained from his face for half a second before returning. Linda leaned closer to me. They're here already. I kept my eyes forward. NCIS. Probably not just NCIS anymore. That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. Because once multiple federal agencies become involved, situations stop being private forever. The courtroom filled slowly after that. Mostly lawyers, clerks, a few curious locals, and older couples waiting for unrelated hearings. Norfolk courts always carried a strange mixture of boredom and tension. Lives changed there every day. Usually quietly. At 9 sharp, the bailiff called us to order. Judge Harold Bennett entered wearing half-moon reading glasses and an expression suggesting he was already tired of everybody in the room. We took our seats. Daniel sat across from me beside his attorney, sweating despite the cool temperature. Dad remained in the gallery directly behind him. The hearing began routinely enough. Inheritance dispute. Questions regarding estate transfers. Concerns about competency during signature authorization. Then Daniel's lawyer made a mistake. He tried turning the entire case toward my military record. "Your Honor," he announced confidently, "we believe the defendant has used exaggerated federal credentials to intimidate family members and influence estate matters." Linda immediately stood. "Objection." But the judge waived for clarification. The attorney continued. "We are prepared to show inconsistencies regarding Commander Brooks's classified service claims." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The line Daniel should never have crossed. The judge looked toward me. "Commander Brooks." Before I could answer, Daniel suddenly stood up himself. "You want to know the truth?" he snapped loudly. His own attorney looked alarmed. "Mr. Brooks." "She's a fraud," Daniel shouted, pointing directly at me. "She disappears for years pretending she's some war hero while the rest of us take care of the family." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Dad looked horrified. But Daniel kept going. "She lies about classified work because nobody can verify it. She's been manipulating everybody for decades." I remained perfectly still. That seemed to anger him even more. "She's an imposter." The word cracked across the courtroom. Then everything changed. The rear doors opened quietly. A man entered wearing a dark federal raincoat beside a woman in navy dress whites. Not ordinary service dress. Investigative command. The room immediately shifted. People sensed authority before a single word was spoken. The woman approached the bench carrying a large sealed envelope stamped with federal markings. Judge Bennett frowned. "What is this?" The federal agent spoke calmly. "Supplemental documentation requested under Federal Review Authority, Your Honor." Daniel's attorney stood abruptly. "We object to—" "You'll sit down," the judge interrupted. The agent handed over the envelope. I watched Judge Bennett open it carefully. Page 1. His expression remained neutral. Page 2. His posture stiffened slightly. Page 3. Everything changed. The color drained from his face. He removed his glasses slowly and reread something. The courtroom had gone completely silent now. Even Daniel stopped breathing. Finally, the judge looked up. Not at me. At Daniel. Then he spoke 4 words. "Put him in cuffs." Nobody moved at first, because nobody fully understood what they'd heard. Then the bailiff turned sharply. "Sir, stand up." Daniel blinked wildly. "What?" "Stand up now." "This is insane," Daniel stammered. "What's happening?" 2 federal marshals entered immediately from the side doors. Dad rose halfway from his seat. "Wait!" he barked. "What the hell is this?" The judge's voice hardened. "Mr. Daniel Brooks is being detained pending federal investigation involving fraud, identity falsification, unlawful access to military records, and financial exploitation connected to protected federal benefits." Dad looked physically unsteady. No, that can't be right." Daniel pointed toward me desperately. "She told me to handle the paperwork." I finally spoke. "No, Daniel, I trusted you to help our parents." The difference mattered. And for the first time in his life, my brother understood nobody could rescue him from it. The marshals cuffed him right there in court. Metal clicking against metal. Dad stared like the world beneath him had suddenly disappeared. Then Judge Bennett turned toward me again. His voice changed completely. Respectful now. "Commander Brooks, why exactly was this court not informed of your protected operational status?" The room fell silent again. I answered honestly. "Because I was trying to protect my family." The judge studied me for several seconds. Then he glanced toward the federal agent. "Is the documentation verified?" "Yes, Your Honor." He nodded slowly. "Fully. Completely." Dad looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. Or maybe for the first time in his life, seeing me clearly at all. Then he whispered the saddest words I've ever heard from another human being. "Evelyn, what did you do all those years?" I looked at my father quietly while federal officers led my brother from the courtroom. And the truth was, I wasn't sure how to answer that question anymore. After the courtroom hearing, I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour before realizing I'd crossed the bridge toward Portsmouth without remembering any of it. That happens sometimes after shock. Not dramatic shock like explosions or gunfire. Emotional shock. The kind that settles into your bones slowly after years of holding yourself together. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while I sat parked near the Elizabeth River, watching tugboats move through gray water. My brother had just been arrested. My father looked shattered. And somehow none of it felt victorious. That surprised me most. People think revenge feels triumphant when the moment finally comes. Like fireworks. Like justice descending from heaven. But sitting there alone in my car at 58 years old, all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind carried by people who spent too long trying to earn love from folks who already decided not to give it. My phone rang around noon. Linda. You all right? I think so. That's not convincing. I gave a quiet laugh. No, probably not. She hesitated. Your father asked for your address. That tightened something inside my chest immediately. What did you tell him? Nothing yet. I stared out toward the water. What condition was he in? Honestly, she said softly, he looked like a man who just realized he's been asleep for 20 years. That stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. 3 days later, Dad called. Not Daniel. Not lawyers. Dad. I nearly didn't answer. But I did. Hello. Silence first. Then his voice. Small somehow. Evelyn. Yes, sir. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Could we talk? There are moments in life when entire decades seem to balance on one sentence. This felt like one of them. All right. He asked if I could come by the house. The house. Not home anymore. Just the house. I drove there the following Sunday. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as always. American flags fluttering on porches, lawnmowers humming in distant yards, older couples walking tiny dogs along sidewalks cracked by tree roots. Ordinary American life continuing while our family quietly collapsed behind closed doors. Dad opened the front door before I reached it. He looked older than he had 1 week earlier. Much older. Grief had already hollowed him out after Mom died. Now shame seemed to finish the job. Thanks for coming. I nodded. Inside the house felt painfully empty without Mom. No music playing softly from the kitchen radio. No smell of cinnamon candles. No voice asking whether anybody wanted coffee. Just silence. Dad gestured toward the kitchen table. We sat across from each other exactly where countless arguments and quiet disappointments had unfolded over the years. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Dad finally said it. I went to see Daniel yesterday. I stayed quiet. He says the government twisted everything. I looked down briefly. And do you believe him? Dad rubbed both hands together slowly. I don't know what to believe anymore. At least it was honest. That mattered. I reviewed the bank records, he continued quietly. The real ones. His voice cracked slightly on the word real. There's more missing than I knew. Yes. He took money from your mother. Another crack in his voice. Yes. Dad swallowed hard. I keep thinking about how many times I defended him. I watched the old kitchen clock tick behind him. Funny how ordinary sounds become louder during painful conversations. Tick. 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 Finally, Dad looked at me directly. Why didn't you tell me about the money you were sending? I answered honestly. Because you would have credited Daniel for it anyway. That landed hard. He looked away immediately. And for the first time in my entire life, my father truly had no defense ready. The silence stretched long enough to hurt. Then he whispered, I failed you. Simple words. But they seemed to cost him everything. I leaned back slowly in my chair. You loved him differently. Dad shook his head immediately. No, I loved him easier. That sentence stunned me. Because it was true. Daniel demanded very little accountability. He stayed nearby, told Dad what he wanted to hear, fit neatly into his understanding of what a son should be. I challenged things. Left home. Joined the Navy. Built a life Dad never fully understood. You know, he said quietly when you enlisted, I told people you'd probably quit. I smiled sadly. I know. His eyes lifted sharply. How? Because Mom told me. That nearly broke him. He covered his mouth with one hand and stared down at the table. I thought I was protecting you. From what? The world. I shook my head gently. No, Dad, you were protecting your idea of me. Tears filled his eyes then. Not dramatic crying. Older men from his generation rarely cry openly. But grief leaked through him anyway. I didn't know how to talk to you after you changed. That sentence unlocked something in me too. Because maybe I hadn't fully understood him either. Men like my father grew up during a different America, one where emotions stayed buried beneath work and routine, one where daughters married local boys and sons carried family names. Then suddenly women entered military careers, leadership roles, federal operations. The world changed faster than some fathers could emotionally keep up. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained part of it. I waited 30 years for you to say you were proud of me, I admitted softly. Dad closed his eyes. I was. I laughed quietly through sudden tears. You had a strange way of showing it. He nodded painfully. Yes, I did. We sat there a long time after that. Not fixing everything. Some damage doesn't repair in one conversation. But for the first time in decades, we were speaking honestly instead of performing family roles. Eventually, Dad stood and disappeared down the hallway. When he returned, he carried a worn cardboard box. What's this? Your mother kept these. Inside were photographs. Letters. Newspaper clippings. Every promotion announcement the Navy ever mailed home. Every photograph I'd ever sent from deployments. Even old articles mentioning humanitarian operations overseas. Mom had saved everything. Dad looked embarrassed suddenly. She used to make me read your letters out loud. I smiled through tears. She did. Said if I listened long enough, maybe I'd stop pretending you were still 16. We both laughed softly at that. Then Dad reached into the box and pulled out a folded paper. My Navy retirement ceremony invitation. Still unopened. I was gonna come, he whispered. I stared at him. What stopped you? He answered without looking up. Daniel said you probably didn't really want us there. The room went very still. 30 years. So many things suddenly made sense. Not all at once, but enough. I finally understood something heartbreaking. My brother hadn't only stolen money. He'd spent years stealing connection itself. Separating people slowly. Twisting conversations. Redirecting love. And my father had let it happen because believing Daniel was easier than questioning him. Dad looked at me carefully then. Is there any way back from this? I thought about that for a long time before answering. Yes, I said finally, but it's slow. He nodded. I got time. And for the first time in my life, I believed he meant it. Daniel accepted a plea agreement 3 months later. No prison drama. No emotional courtroom confession. Real life is quieter than television. He pled guilty to financial fraud, unlawful access to protected records, and elder exploitation involving federal benefit funds. Because he cooperated eventually and had no violent criminal history, the sentence was lighter than many people expected. 4 years in federal prison. Restitution payments. Permanent felony charges. When the hearing ended, he glanced back at me only once before deputies escorted him away. I wish I could tell you I felt satisfaction. I didn't. I mostly felt grief. Not just for what Daniel became. For what we all allowed ourselves to become together. Families rarely collapse because of one villain. Usually collapse happens through years of silence, avoidance, pride, and people refusing to ask difficult questions. That realization stayed with me long after the court case ended. Life settled into a slower rhythm after that. Dad started calling every Sunday morning around 8. Always the same opening. You awake? Yes, sir. Good. Thought maybe we could get breakfast. At first, the conversation stayed careful, surface-level things, weather, football, yard maintenance, local news. But slowly, honesty began slipping into the spaces between us. One morning at a diner near Chesapeake Bay, Dad stared down at his coffee and quietly admitted, "You know what scares me most?" "What?" "That your mother saw all this coming before I did." I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. She probably did. She tried warning me about Daniel sometimes. I looked up. What did you say? Dad gave a tired smile. Usually told her she worried too much. That sounded exactly like him. We sat beside the window watching gulls circle over the water. Finally he whispered, "She deserved better from both of us." I nodded once. Yes, she did. The strangest part about reconciliation at our age is how ordinary it looks from the outside. People expect dramatic speeches and sudden healing. Instead, it's usually tiny things. Dad started asking questions about my Navy years. Real questions. Not polite conversation. Genuine curiosity. What exactly did Logistics Command do? How long were your deployments? Were you scared over there? Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I didn't. Certain operations remained classified even after retirement. But for the first time in my life, my father listened instead of judging. One afternoon, I brought him to a retirement recognition ceremony hosted by a local Navy association. Nothing huge. Just older veterans gathering at a community hall near the harbor. Coffee. American flags. Bad sheet cake from a grocery store bakery. The kind of event younger people might find boring, but older Americans understand deeply. Quiet respect. Shared history. A retired admiral spoke briefly about military families and unseen sacrifice. Then several former officers presented me with a commemorative plaque recognizing 30 years of service. When the applause started, I noticed Dad sitting frozen beside the aisle. Not embarrassed. Overwhelmed. Afterward, an elderly Marine approached him. "You Commander Brooks' father." Dad nodded. The Marine smiled warmly. "You raised one hell of an officer." I watched my father's face carefully. Pride. Regret. Love. Pain. All arriving at once. On the drive home, he stared silently out the passenger window almost the entire time. Finally, he said, "I spent years thinking strength looked loud." I glanced over. "What do you mean?" Daniel was loud, charming, confident. He shook his head slowly. "You were steady." I mistook quietness for weakness. That sentence stayed with me for days afterward. Because I think many families make that same mistake. The loud child often receives attention. The dependable child quietly carries burdens nobody notices until much later. A month after the ceremony, I started volunteering twice a week at a Veterans Legal Assistance Center in Norfolk. Mostly paperwork. Financial guidance. Helping older veterans avoid scams. You'd be shocked how many elderly Americans lose savings through family manipulation. Sons, grandchildren, caregivers. Loneliness makes people vulnerable. Trust makes them even more vulnerable. One afternoon, an 82-year-old Korean War widow sat crying across from me because her nephew emptied her bank account while pretending to help manage finances. I reached across the table gently and told her something I wish somebody had told my father years earlier. Love should never require surrendering your dignity. She cried harder after that. So did I once she left. Dad improved slowly over the following months. Not physically. Age keeps collecting its debt eventually. But emotionally. He apologized more. Listened more. Defended me openly when old family acquaintances made ignorant comments about women in the military. One Sunday evening, we sat together on folding chairs beside the bay watching fishing boats return at sunset. Dad looked thinner now. Frailer. But somehow lighter, too. "I wrote Daniel," he said quietly. I turned toward him. "How'd that go?" He answered. Dad stared out toward the water. "He said he spent years resenting you because you actually became the person he pretended to be. That hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel. Because it probably contained truth." Dad sighed heavily. "I failed him too, Evelyn." I considered that carefully before answering. "Yes," I said softly, "but he still made his own choices. That distinction mattered. Parents shape us. But eventually, adults become responsible for what they do with the shaping." The sun dipped lower across the water. Orange light stretched across the harbor like melted copper. After a while, Dad asked quietly, "You think your mother would forgive us?" I smiled faintly. "I think Mom forgave people long before they deserved it." He laughed softly through tears. "Yeah, that sounds like her." When Dad passed away the following spring from heart complications, we had his memorial service at the same church where we buried Mom. Smaller crowd this time. Quieter. I wore civilian black again instead of dress uniform. After the service, Pastor Green handed me a small envelope Dad had left behind. Inside was a handwritten note. Just one paragraph. I was proud of you long before I knew how to say it. Thank you for giving an old man time to learn the difference between pride and love. I sat alone in my car afterward and cried harder than I had during the funeral itself. Not because everything had been fixed. Because it hadn't. But because in the end we finally stopped lying to each other. And sometimes that's the closest thing families ever get to peace. If you've listened this far, maybe there's someone in your own life you need to call. Maybe someone you misunderstood. Maybe someone who served quietly while louder voices took all the attention. Life moves fast when you're young. But after 60, most of us learn the same truth eventually. The people who love us steadily are often the ones we appreciate too late. If this story touched you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs it. And if you still have time left with the people you love, ask the hard questions now. Before silence answers for them.